This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
Toughens you. So, who makes it through Beast? It was 2004 in my second year of graduate school in psychology when I set about answering that question. But for decades, the U.S. Army has been asking the same thing. In fact, it was in 1955, almost 50 years before I began working on this puzzle, that a young psychologist named Jerry Kagan was drafted into the Army, ordered to report to West Point, and assigned to test new cadets for the purpose of identifying who would stay and who would leave. As fate would have it, Jerry was not only the first psychologist to study dropping out at West Point, he was also the first psychologist I met in college. I ended up working part-time in his lab for 2 years. Jerry described early efforts to separate the wheat from the chaff at West Point as dramatically unsuccessful. He recalled in particular spending hundreds of hours showing cadets cards printed with pictures and asking the young men to make up stories to fit them. This test was meant to unearth deep-seated unconscious motives, and the general idea was that cadets who visualized noble deeds and courageous accomplishments should be the ones who would graduate instead of dropping out. Like a lot of ideas that sound good in principle, this one didn't work so well in practice. The stories the cadets told were colorful and fun to listen to, but they had absolutely nothing to do with decisions the cadets made in their actual lives. Since then, several more generations of psychologists devoted themselves to the attrition issue, but not one researcher could say with much certainty why some of the most promising cadets routinely quit when their training had just begun. Soon after learning about Beast, I found my way to the office of Mike Matthews, a military psychologist who's been a West Point faculty member for years. Mike explained that the West Point admissions process successfully identified men and women who had the potential to thrive there. In particular, admissions staff calculate for each applicant something called the whole candidate score, a weighted average of SAT or ACT exam scores, high school rank adjusted for the number of students in the applicant's graduating class, expert appraisals of leadership potential, and performance on objective measures of physical fitness. You can think of the whole candidate score as West Point's best guess at how much talent applicants have for the diverse rigors of its 4-year program. In other words, it's an estimate of how easily cadets will master the many skills required of a military leader. The whole candidate score is the single most important factor in West Point admissions, and yet it didn't reliably predict who would make it through Beast. In fact, cadets with the highest whole candidate scores were just as likely to drop out as those with the lowest, and this is why Mike's door was open to me. From his own experience joining the Air Force as a young man, Mike had a clue to the riddle. While the rigors of his induction weren't quite as harrowing as those of West Point, there were notable similarities. The most important were challenges that exceeded current skills. For the first time in their lives, Mike and the other recruits were being asked, on an hourly basis, to do things they couldn't yet do. Within 2 weeks, Mike recalls, I was tired, lonely, frustrated, and ready to quit, as were all of my classmates. Some did quit, but Mike did not. What struck Mike was that rising to the occasion had almost nothing to do with talent. Those who dropped out of training rarely did so from lack of ability. Rather, what mattered, Mike said, was a never-give-up attitude. Around that time, it wasn't just Mike Matthews who was talking to me about this kind of hang-in-there posture toward challenge. As a graduate student just beginning to probe the psychology of success, I was interviewing leaders in business, art, athletics, journalism, academia, medicine, and law. Who are the people at the very top of your field? I asked these leaders. What are they like? What do you think makes them special? Some of the characteristics that emerged in these interviews were very field-specific. For instance, more than one business person mentioned an appetite for taking financial risks. You've got to be able to make calculated decisions about millions of dollars and still go to sleep at night, one told me. But this seemed entirely beside the point for artists, who instead mentioned a drive to create. One said, "I like making stuff. I don't know why, but I do." In contrast, athletes mentioned a different kind of motivation.